Hi everybody, I'm Adam. Welcome once again to the Farm and Country Podcast. It's episode 18. Today is Monday. It's still the month of May, but we've only got like 2-3 days left here, so I would say that it's pretty much June. And if you haven't got your gardens in, well, what are you waiting for? Get them in there. I know that some people in Texas are already harvesting blueberries. That's just crazy. We're still buying blueberries for $10 a tiny little half pint in the store, so we don't usually get blueberries till August, maybe July. Anyway, so today's episode's brought to you by Audible. Audible is my go-to for entertaining myself while I'm doing chores, while I'm doing anything really. And you can get a free audiobook without paying any money right now. Go to audibletrials.com/FCP, sign up for the free trial, download your first free audiobook, listen to it. If you absolutely hate it, and why would you hate it? I mean, obviously select a good audiobook, but if you hate it, you don't even have to continue with the trial. You can just cancel, keep your audiobook, and you still spend no money. But if you continue with Audible, they have a wonderful monthly subscription, and it gives you 1 or 2 audiobooks every month that you can just listen to whenever you want. Okay, with that, let's get into our main topic. Today I want to talk to you about water sources. So this is one of those things that I just didn't think about when we first moved out to the country here, but it's one of those hard realities, those in-your-face things that you just have to solve. And then once you solve it, it's probably going to be solved forever. I mean, generally speaking, people don't have to do this, have to worry about their water year by year. They pick a way to get water, and then it's usually good for a long time. Unlike firewood, where you've got to go out and get firewood every year, having your water source is usually something that, takes a little bit of time and definitely takes some money to solve. But once you solve it, it's done. And I'm not just talking about water for your home. I'm talking about just water generally. If you've got a source of water, then you can run livestock. But if you don't, you are going to quickly find out that not having water available is a huge drawback and a huge detriment to your plans for expansion, raising animals, anything. Now, sometimes when you buy a piece of property, it comes with a good water source, and if you've already got that, then you're set, or at least you're kind of set. Now, there are ways to improve your water source, ways to make it more available. I mean, if it's kind of a seasonal thing, there are ways to solve that problem, and we'll talk about that. But if you don't have any source of water whatsoever, which was the case for us when we moved to our quarter section out here in the middle of the bald arse prairie, we didn't have anything set up for water at all. The 2 neighbors that we've got have their own water thing. One neighbor gets water from a municipal water supply, which is kind of crazy because we are a long way from the municipal water source, but it's piped out there. Unfortunately, that's not an option for us. They're not expanding this municipal water supply. Anybody who's on it is just on it. If you're not, well, too bad. My other neighbor, on the other hand, does the same thing that I do. He hauls in water from town, and that's an okay solution for us right now. I'm hoping to stop doing that, or at least reduce the amount of water that we need to get, because it does cost a little bit of money and it does take some time. Also, storing the water is a challenge. So if you live in a northern climate, or even in a mid-level climate, if you're in the United States and you live anywhere where it freezes over the winter time for any significant amount of time, you need to consider cold as basically being a huge factor in where you store your water. or if you are storing water. Now, everybody talks about wells. Wells are a big thing. If you have a well, great. If you don't have a well and you're like, well, I need to dig a well. Okay, well, yeah, you can dig a well. But there are other ways to get water without digging a well. Because I know for a fact, here, at least here in Alberta, you have to get a permit to dig a well. And the cost of doing that, without any guarantee of finding water, and especially without a guarantee of finding good water, the cost is usually $10,000 or more. And the water quality for wells is poor. Here in where I live, there was a well, and it was capped apparently, because the water quality was crap. And so you won't find very many people around my area who are pulling water from a well. And if they are, they're probably not too thrilled about the water quality. You know, it tends to be very mineralized. It tends to have, rust and iron bacteria in it. It just sucks. So what else can you do for water? Well, it turns out there's a bunch of things you can do for water, but none of them are very easy. They just require that you sit down and plan out your source. So when we first moved out here, I bought 2 polyurethane big stock tanks. And they're called stock tanks because they're designed for livestock. They're made to be sort of towed out in the middle of a field, filled with water, and used as sort of a portable water source. So they don't have any sort of, they have no frost protection whatsoever. They're not designed to be buried in the ground. They're just designed to set out in a field, and they have a little outlet on it and a filling thing from the top. So they're really simple. They were very inexpensive. They were maybe $600 each. They're quite big. So they were kind of perfect for our first water supply. Now, unfortunately, the first thing I forgot was that water freezes in the winter. So I just put these water tanks out behind the house, and I filled them with some water, and I was like, okay, well, see how that works. Now, to nobody's surprise whatsoever, the water froze solid. So for that whole winter, we didn't have any running water from that water supply. So obviously, I thought, well, okay, now I've got to do something about this. So I excavated a fairly large hole in the ground beside the house, and I built a little tiny wooden frame out of just plywood and 2x4s, nothing treated. It was just a quick, dirty thing. Popped it in the ground just to kind of hold the dirt from filling in around the tanks because it would crush the tanks. That's been our water supply ever since. And we fill the water tank using a tank that sits on the back of our truck, and I go and I fill it in town. It's not super expensive, but it costs something. It's about $5 to fill a fairly large tank, and it provides about 1 week's worth of water. And these 2 tanks, for a long time, have been sitting in this little hole. I had a little, I had some piping attached to them, and it worked fine. I had some heat tape attached on the pipe that goes into the house so it wouldn't freeze. And even in the coldest parts of winter, even though these things were literally just sitting in a hole in the ground with nothing but a piece of plywood over top, they still stayed unfrozen on the bottom half. So that showed me that, ground source heat is an excellent way to keep your water from freezing. That's a free tip there, guys. So what happened this last spring is something that happens all the time with these water tanks. Is the hole that I've got the tanks in filled with spring runoff. And because the tanks weren't filled with water at the time, they acted like a boat, and they floated and pushed. They lifted up out of the tank, and the pipe detached. So basically, now I've got to redo that entire thing because only one of the tanks is attached to the pipe. And only one tank is not really enough storage for me. And besides, I've been meaning to change this system for a long time now. And my wife and I, we've been talking about what we want to do this summer, and we've kind of decided to put off this big renovation of building a basement in favor of sorting out some of the other things that we've got to do first. And one of the things on the top of my list is our water supply. So I'll tell you exactly what I'm going to do. And this is something that is done all over the world. It's done in countries like Africa. It's done in everywhere. And it's a great way to store water. It can be done in a desert. It can be done in any climate as long as you protect the thing that you're building from frost. It's a permanent solution for water, and I already know how to build this, so it works. I know that I can do it. So without further ado, I'll tell you what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about a Ferrocement tank. Now, okay, so what is Ferrocement? Ferrocement is basically concrete, but it's not quite concrete. It's plaster concrete. It's not cement that you would pour in a post hole, because that kind of cement has giant rocks in it, and it's a different type of mix. The type of cement I'm talking about here is a really fine, it's basically plaster, but with concrete. So what you do is you mix 3 parts fine sand, not fine sand, it could be any kind of sand really, 3 parts sand, 1 part Portland cement, and enough water to make it, malleable. And then you set up a framework of rebar and metal lathe and metal wire mesh, and you basically plaster over top of that. And you put several coats of plaster over top of that, plaster being the concrete, the cement plaster. And then you let it harden. And what you get is a very, very durable, very strong, thin wall, basically. And it's you can make it into really any shape. So you can curve it, you can make it round, it's actually, the best shape is perfectly round, because that's the strongest shape. Now, the strength doesn't come from the concrete. The strength comes from the fact that it's impregnated with metal. But it doesn't have to be metal. You can actually use fabric. You can use wood, but I wouldn't recommend using wood because wood rots, and this is going to be holding water. But you can use concrete that's impregnated with fibers, and I don't remember what that stuff is called now, but you can still get that stuff. It's basically a coating that you can put, and it's got fibers impregnated into it, and it's a good way to build strength into something when you're plastering over top of it. So how do you build these Ferrocement things? You got to dig a hole in the ground, obviously. Then you've got to shape the bottom of the hole so that it curves downward, and this is going to provide more strength. You don't want to build a flat base because you're going to have the weight of a ton of water sitting on top of that. So you want to have as strong a shape as possible. You want to get it to be kind of like an egg almost. So you have to build a base for it. So you build a Ferrocement base, and there's a book that you can buy that teaches you how to do this. And if I can find it, I'll send you a link to that if it's on Amazon. I actually own the book, but it's I've owned it for probably about 10 years now, so I don't even know if it's in print. But there's also a website that I'll link to as well on how to build Ferrocement tanks. And it's a great way to get an easy, quick water tank that holds quite a bit. The tank that I'd like to build is probably going to be about 8,000 gallons, and that's enough for 4 or so months, which will probably get us through the worst of winter. And we'll just we'll refill it maybe once during the winter, and then it should be good. So that's a Ferrocement tank. I won't go on and on about that one because just waste the entire time here. But let's talk about building ponds and capturing water. Okay, so this is something that I did last year, and it's something that I'm going to expand on in years to come. But I did my first crack at this last year, because last year was the first year that we had any major livestock out here. So it didn't work out like I had it exactly planned, but it worked out extremely well for a different reason. And it was kind of odd what actually happened with our water supply, but it was good. I was very happy with it. So when we moved out here, there was a section that's quite far from our house that did have some water on it, but it wasn't accessible for livestock, at least not very easily. It was a section of our field that's basically fenced off from everything else, and it's way too far away to rely on it for livestock because it is fenced off, and because the fence isn't suitable for sheep in that area. I'm not letting my sheep in there because they'll just duck under the fence, basically. And I'm not, obviously not cool with that. So I knew I had to have several water sources on our property, and they had to be located in different areas so that when I move the animals around, each area has its own water source. So what I did, and this is dead simple, is I already knew some areas that experienced spring runoff and flooded. I had some flooding areas, so I thought, you know what, this area obviously has a lot of water that drains to it, and if you know your property, you'll be able to tell where the water's draining to. So you want to dig a pond wherever it is that's the bottom of your watershed. Okay, a watershed is just the bottom of your water drainage basin. And even in this dry climate, we get a fairly good amount of water every spring in the form of runoff. So basically, I went and found the areas where this water was running off, and I dug just a hole in the ground with an excavator. So what happened? Okay, so what I expected to happen was that the water would run in there and collect and just remain in there. But that didn't happen. See, these little water things that I dug, they're not collecting water. They're actually pushing water in from the ground. So basically, I've tapped into an open spring almost, and I'm getting groundwater basically coming and filling these ponds. Now, they're not filling the ponds because the groundwater fluctuates, but there's an unexpected side effect here in that the capacity of the pond is irrelevant because it always refills from the ground. So it's kind of a cool little thing that happened out here. It's basically like a big open well that just refills from ground source water. And I didn't even have to dig down that deep. I only dug, one of the ponds is probably 8 feet deep, and that's deep, but it's full to the brim, and it's quite large. So really, it didn't have to be 8 feet deep, but I thought, well, let's go deep, and that way if the water drops quite a bit, the pond will never be completely empty. So that pond has never been basically just below the surface of the ground. So I know for a fact now that water, the ground water right there, is quite high. And even last year, which was one of the driest years I can remember, the groundwater was still coming up and filling that pond. And I know that the animals were drinking from it because I saw them, I watched them. And it was safe to drink because none of them died. And they've been drinking from it for a year and some now. It is a little bit saline, but it's not so saline, that is with salt and minerals, and it's not so bad that they can't drink it. And they do quite well on it. It's safe to drink for them. Like I said, none of them have been poisoned or died, or even showed any signs of ill health effects. So I've basically got a pretty much unlimited source of water for animals. Now, what I want to do in the future is expand that water source, and I want to create an area where I'm storing that groundwater, basically impounding it. So there's a way to do this. There's actually many ways to do this, but one of the ways that I know of to do it is that you build, and you have to line this, you build an above ground pond, and you take an excavator and some earth moving equipment, and you build a berm, a big huge berm in a square or a circle or whatever shape you like. Build a heart or a shape of a llama, doesn't matter, because you're just going to line this berm with waterproof material. Now, why do you have to line it with waterproof material? Well, it's just the easiest way to make the water stay there. There's other ways to do this, though, but they're not quite as easy. You can actually line and seal a pond using animals and clay. And the Romans used to do this when they were building aqueducts. They would dig an aqueduct, and I assume they would dig it by hand, because they didn't have access to excavators. So they would dig this aqueduct, and then they would run sheep through it. And what happens is that when the sheep are stampeding through this aqueduct, the hooves of the sheep are basically pressing the soil in and compacting it. And it compacts the clay in the soil and makes it mostly waterproof. And the more you do it, obviously, the more waterproof it will become. But it's an easy, fast way to line a pond. Now, obviously, you need two things if you're going to do this. You need either soil that has a high clay content, or you need to add clay. Okay, those are the only two ways that this is going to work for you. If you don't have any clay in your soil, it's not going to work, because clay is the material that seals when you're running animals through this. And if you don't have clay and you can't get enough clay, then use a pond liner. Although pond liners are definitely more expensive. Okay, so there's a special type of clay that people like to use. It's called bentonite clay. And if you're sealing a pond, then you're looking for bentonite clay. And you can buy it in bags. There's a couple sources I know here of in the city that's closest to me, bentonite clay. And basically what's cool about this clay is that when it gets wet, it expands. And when it expands, obviously, if there's any tiny little holes in the soil where water can filter out, then it seals those. So the best way to seal a pond, in my opinion, would be to get some bentonite clay on your pond, and you're going to want to dig past you dig down deep enough that you've got a good base. Put your bentonite clay in there and seal it using animals. Now, how would you do that with animals? Well, I've never done this, so I can only speculate, but I would just put a temporary fencing around where the animals, around the water source. If it's empty, get your animals in there and feed them hay. Keep them in there for a little while, and then just feed them. And they'll stomp around in there, and if there's any water at the bottom, they'll drink it. So just keep them alive, keep them safe, keep them healthy, but keep them in the little area and try to encourage them to move around. Get them walking through it. You could also just do that for one day, fence them in there, and if you've got a lot of animals, they'll stomp it down quite quickly. So that's a couple of ways to seal a pond. There's also one last way that I'll talk about here. It's called the Gali Method, and it's basically, this was made by the Russians, I think, and it involves straw. So you put you dig your pond out, or your dugout, if you're going to call it that, and then you smooth the bottom of it, and then you put a layer of straw over top of that, and then you put a layer of dirt over top of the straw. So it has to be kind of a straw sandwich, with straw being the peanut butter in the middle. And what happens to that straw once the water gets in there and infiltrates is the straw breaks down, but it doesn't go anywhere. So it turns into this kind of rubbery, gluey substance, and it's called clay. And you can actually see this happen. If you ever mulch with newspaper, and you put too much newspaper in there, Basically what happens is the newspaper breaks down, but it doesn't go anywhere. So it turns into this thick, sort of rubbery, gooey material. And there has to be moisture, obviously, for that to happen. But then it stops water from infiltrating. So it's kind of an interesting methodology to make a waterproof pond lining. I don't know exactly how you do it. I recommend a Google search. Just type in GLEY and then lining pond, and you'll find probably a whole bunch of people who've tried this. If you're into permaculture, I'll bet you Permies.com has got information on that. Oh, if you haven't been to Permies.com, you need to go. It's a huge forum based on permaculture. If you don't know what permaculture is, just go there. Just go there. And I'll put a link in the show notes for you guys so you don't forget to click on Permies.com. By the way, that I don't get any money for that. I'm just recommending that site because it's a great site. So that's it, guys. Talking about getting water sources on your property. So I got sort of a takeaway here. The number one thing is that remember that water freezes. The number two thing is build a permanent water supply using concrete if you can. If you can't, get proper, buriable, that is water tanks that are designed to be buried in the ground, and then use that as your permanent water supply. Even if you have a well, you can still put in a cistern, because if something happens to your well, or the well sort of won't supply a lot of water at a time, you can put in a trickle of water into your cistern, and that way your well is always supplying a little bit of water, and it never gets totally tapped out, but you'll have far more water available at any given time through your cistern. Okay, so that's a little tip there on water supply. So that's it for Monday's show, guys. Hopefully you got something out of that. We're going to have an excellent show on Friday. I've got an online job for you guys that's real and true. I mean, we've all heard the work from home. This mom, you've seen the ads on the side of the screen where it's like, this mom earned $20,000 a day working from home with this simple 2-minute thing. Okay, this is not one of those scam things where get rich quick in 2 minutes. You're not going to get rich doing this, but it is an absolutely solid work from home idea, and it's only growing every single year. Okay, so come back on Friday. Listen to the show. It's going to be good. That's it, guys. Thanks a lot for listening, and have a good night.